Ink to paper, signed into law. The Inflation Reduction Act was officially signed by President Biden this week. And while inflation is in its name, it's being touted as the biggest step in climate action that we've ever seen. It invests $370 billion to combat climate change. The law promises more tax credits for Americans that drive electric vehicles and install solar panels, and it invests towards cleaner grid and clean energy jobs. So to help break this down with me, we are inviting political analyst and researcher at the University of Cincinnati, Dr. Brian Calfano. Dr. Calfano, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Elisa. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Now, first off, right, it's called the Inflation Reduction Act, right? But as we just mentioned, it's really got a lot of initiative towards climate action. What are some of the ways in which this law really addresses climate change?
Well, this is going to be, I think, the kind of bill that we look back on and we say, this was the beginning of a down payment on the future. And in moving the world, not just our country, toward a more sustainable way to produce and consume energy. I think people may hear that and go, we've been talking about this issue now for so long. How is it the beginning? It's the beginning because it's been a long time just to get people to, I think, wrap their heads around the reality, which you've been talking about for a long time, Elisa. And so is Climate Central and other organizations, that we are dealing with a crisis that needs addressing, and to get the kind of really cooperation that we need to move this to a situation where we don't have the kinds of emissions, carbon emissions that we're used to seeing in the world. We're going to have a transformation, and it takes transformational types of laws to do that. And the structure of this one really pushes us in that transformational direction.
Now, in this bill, there's a lot of different, well, I guess law now, right? There's a lot of different things in there, and some of which also talk about bigger companies, those with more money. Does this, when it comes to the climate incentives, really cater to everyone in those incentives?
The question is a good one in the sense of, will there be winners and losers? I think in terms of the renewable energy sector, wind and solar have been at the forefront of everyone's thinking, and in terms of a lot of the funding that has already come. There's been some talk that the producers of clean hydrogen have been maybe left behind a bit. This law rectifies that to a large extent because there's now emphasis in the bill specifically on clean hydrogen development, battery development, large batteries to be able to hold the energy, be able to hold what we produce. Because right now, our grid, generally, you produce it and it goes on the grid for consumption. If you're going to be able to make maximum use of solar panels and wind and the other renewables, you're going to have a much better way to store that energy and to be able to release it at peak times. We've not been able to do that, which is why we've had to have a lot of the old fossil fuel plants on standby to be able to make up for the lack of capacity the renewables have had. This law addresses that to an extent it's not been addressed before. And so there's a lot of reason for optimism moving forward. But we're also talking about a 10-year time span, both in the law and I think also in terms of getting this development up to scale to be able to have it implemented and to have enough of it around the country to make a difference.
Like you said, this is like a huge first step for us. But do you foresee any challenges in really getting to get this ball rolling? Any loopholes that maybe the fossil fuel industry can use to slow this down? Or, we know with climate change, time is not on our side, right? We need to get this done pretty quickly.
Well, exactly. And in terms of the fossil fuel companies, it's one of these, apparently you see this with the Biden administration. It's a love-hate relationship on certain levels, right? And the Democrats came in 2 years ago saying, we're going to go to clean energy as fast as we can. And then you have really the global energy crisis brought on particularly by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and lots of issues now with people paying a lot of money at the pump. And there's not an easy, quick fix with this. And so I think where you end up seeing the fossil fuel companies getting a benefit out of it is to essentially say, look, we still have a role to play here in providing energy. At what point do we say thank you, fossil fuel companies, for your contribution to our society, but we really now need to kind of leave you behind. We have to be in a position to do that effectively, though. And unless the renewables are there with the kind of reliability that we're used to from the fossil fuels, I think it's going to be tricky to get the consumer to make that switch. We have to think through, really, as a society, what our priorities are. And that's going to require us not only to look at these other alternatives when it comes to the energy that we consume, but also the amount that we consume, because we're not going to be able to reduce carbon emissions to the point that will meet the requirements or to meet the projections from the UN and other bodies looking at this, unless we have a substantial reduction in use. And that's something that's a very unpopular political thing to talk about, no matter what side you're on. But it's an important discussion to have, particularly when we still have time to do something about this. And that window is rapidly closing, but at least some folks, some experts in this area think that there's still time to make a difference. And so it's really an all hands on deck kind of approach. Government to this point with this law, Elisa, has done what it can for now. And I think it's up to the private sector and for the American public to take up this call and to really make the difference for the future.
Yes, you're right. Window is closing very rapidly. The science tells us that every day. Dr. Brian Calfano, political analyst and researcher with the University of Cincinnati, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.